One early morning in the spring of April 2012, a man was walking through a quiet, wooded area in coastal France. He lived in a small house nearby, and he had just stepped out onto his porch to enjoy his morning coffee when he noticed a thin, dark column of smoke rising above the trees. The wind was blowing gently from the coast, carrying the smoke toward his property. Right away, he felt a surge of concern. It was a particularly dry season, and the thought of a brush fire or forest fire spreading through the dense pine trees was terrifying to anyone living in the area, and so he decided to go check it out. He put down his cup, put on his boots, and walked into the forest, following the path that led toward the source of the smoke. As he got deeper into the woods, the smell of burning wood grew stronger, but it also started to change. He walked through the thick undergrowth, pushing past branches and stepping over fallen logs, until he finally reached a small clearing in the trees. When he stepped into the clearing, he immediately felt a sense of relief. What he saw was not a spreading forest fire at all. It was just the remains of a large bonfire. The flames had died down, and the wood was just smoldering now, with a steady stream of gray smoke rising into the air. He figured some local teenagers had probably been out here partying the night before and had left the fire to burn itself out. He was about to turn around and head back to his house to grab a bucket of water to douse the embers, but then he took a deep breath. There was a weird, heavy smell in the air that was clearly coming from the smoldering ash. It did not smell like pine or oak. It was a sweet, sickening, organic smell that made his throat tighten. Curious and a bit unsettled, the man took a few tentative steps closer to the smoldering pile. There was nobody else around, and the woods were completely silent except for the gentle rustling of the leaves in the breeze. He shielded his face from the heat and peered into the center of the blackened logs. At first, he could only see charred wood and thick gray ash. But as he looked closer, he realized there was something large lying right in the middle of the fire. It was a long, dark shape, and as the smoke shifted, the man froze. He realized he was looking at a charred human body. The legs and arms were badly burned, and the torso was heavily blackened by the heat, but there was no mistake about what it was. The man stumbled backward, his heart pounding against his ribs. He turned and ran back through the woods as fast as his legs could carry him, scrambling back to his house to call the local police. Little did he know, this gruesome discovery in the coastal woods of southern France would soon unravel a complex web of lies, betrayal, and passion that stretched all the way to the French Alps, involving some of the most prominent citizens of a quiet mountain town. To understand how this body ended up in the woods, we have to travel over 200 miles away to the beautiful, historic city of Chambéry. Chambéry is located in southeastern France, nestled in a valley surrounded by the towering, snow-capped peaks of the Alps. It is a picturesque place, known for its historic architecture, its quiet streets, and its wealthy residents. But Chambéry also had a lively nightlife scene with plenty of bars, pubs, and nightclubs that stayed busy late into the night. And on the night of April 26, 2012, a 39-year-old bouncer named Lionel Vines was standing outside one of the most popular clubs in the city. Lionel was a tall, heavily built man with a commanding presence, but he was also known for his warm smile and his easygoing personality. He had spent years working in the local nightlife scene, and he was a fixture in Chambéry. Just about everyone who went out on the weekends knew Lionel, or at least recognized him. He was the kind of guy who kept the peace, diffused arguments before they turned into fights, and made sure everyone had a safe night. But Lionel's life was not just about working the door at clubs. Because of his size and his reputation for being reliable and tough, he also picked up side work as a personal bodyguard. He was often hired by the wealthy tourists and high-profile visitors who came to Chambéry to vacation or do business. It was an exciting and glamorous line of work, but it could also be incredibly dangerous. In fact, just a few months prior, Lionel had been working a bodyguard gig when a massive fistfight broke out. Lionel had jumped in to protect his client, fighting off multiple attackers. He had actually ended up getting arrested for his role in the brawl, but it only cemented his reputation as someone who would do whatever it took to keep his clients safe. On this particular night, April 26th, Lionel was just hoping for a quiet, uneventful shift. He stood by the entrance of the crowded club, checking identification cards, greeting regulars, and keeping an eye on the long line of people waiting to get inside. At one point, a woman walked past him to enter the club. She stopped for a moment, looked Lionel directly in the eyes, and gave him a warm, lingering smile. She thanked him by name before disappearing into the crowded, music-filled venue. Lionel smiled back, but he quickly went back to his duties, ushering the next group of people inside. As the night went on, the line outside the door finally started to thin out. Lionel leaned against the doorframe, taking a moment to rest his feet. That was when he saw a familiar figure walking toward him from across the street. It was his good friend, Mike Boof. Mike was one of Lionel's closest buddies, and the two of them went out drinking together multiple times a week. Usually, when Lionel saw Mike, the two of them would laugh, joke around, and make plans for their next day off. But as Mike walked under the streetlights outside the club, Lionel realized that something was very wrong. Mike was not smiling. His face was tense, his brow was furrowed, and he looked incredibly angry. Lionel stood up straight and watched his friend approach. When Mike finally reached the door, Lionel greeted him and asked him what was going on, pointing out that he looked extremely upset. Mike did not answer right away. He just stared at Lionel with a cold, hard expression that made Lionel feel instantly uneasy. Mike finally spoke, and his voice was tight with anger. He told Lionel that he had just come from the house of his friend Philippe Perrier. Lionel had never met Philippe in person, but he certainly knew who he was. Philippe Perrier was incredibly wealthy, and his family owned one of the most famous and successful wineries in the region surrounding Chambéry. They were highly respected, well-connected, and carried a massive amount of influence in the local community. Mike explained that his own electrical business shared a boundary wall with Philippe's winery, meaning the two men saw each other almost every single day and had become very close friends over the years. Mike told Lionel that Philippe's house had been broken into the day before. The burglar had shattered a window, made their way into the basement, and managed to crack open a large safe, stealing a massive amount of cash that had been kept inside. Lionel listened to this, feeling bad for Mike's friend, but he had no idea why Mike was telling him this with such an angry tone. But then, Mike dropped a bombshell. He said that Philippe believed Lionel was the one who had broken into his house and stolen his money. Lionel was completely taken aback. He stared at Mike in disbelief and asked him why on earth Philippe would ever think he had anything to do with the robbery. He had never even set foot on Philippe's property. But Mike just shook his head and told Lionel to stop playing dumb. Mike said that Philippe had found out Lionel was having an affair with his wife, Natalie Perrier, and according to Mike, Natalie was the one who was pointing the finger at Lionel, telling her husband that Lionel must have been the burglar. Hearing this, Lionel felt his heart drop into his stomach. The initial shock of being accused of a robbery suddenly turned into a deep, nervous panic. He felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. The truth was, Lionel could not deny the affair. A couple of months earlier, he had met Natalie Perrier at a nightclub. They had flirted, drank together, and eventually ended up sneaking into the club's coat check room to hook up. It was a brief, passionate encounter, but for Lionel, it was just another fling. He was a popular bouncer who had casual relationships with many different women, and he had pretty much completely forgotten about Natalie since then. He had not seen her or spoken to her in weeks, and he had no idea that she had gone back to her wealthy husband and accused Lionel of breaking into their home. Lionel looked at Mike and tried to defend himself. He swore up and down that he had nothing to do with the robbery. He admitted that he had made a mistake by sleeping with Natalie, but he insisted that it was just a one-time thing, that there was nothing serious between them, and that he would never break into someone's home and steal from them. He pleaded with Mike to believe him, reminding him of their long friendship. But Mike did not seem convinced. He just stared at Lionel with narrowed eyes, nodded slowly, and said he would pass Lionel's message along to Philippe. Then, without another word, Mike turned around and walked away into the dark night, leaving Lionel standing outside the club, sweating and filled with a terrible sense of dread. 3 days passed, and Lionel tried his best to put the confrontation out of his mind, though the anxiety continued to gnaw at him. On the evening of Sunday, April 29, 2012, Lionel was sitting in a comfortable armchair in his living room, wrapping up a phone call. He lived in a modest apartment in Chambéry with his mother and his nephew, Julian. Julian was 25 years old, only 4 years younger than Lionel, so the two of them had grown up together more like brothers than uncle and nephew. They shared a deep bond, and Julian looked up to Lionel as a protector and a guide. On this evening, Julian was sitting on the couch on the other side of the room, half watching a soccer match on the television while Lionel spoke on the phone. When Lionel finally hung up, he let out a long sigh and rubbed his temples. Julian looked over at him and asked who had been on the other end of the line. Lionel got up from his chair, walked over to the couch, and sat down next to his nephew. He told Julian that it was Mike Booth. Julian knew Mike well, so he did not think much of it, but Lionel looked serious. He decided it was time to tell Julian what had been going on. He explained the whole situation: the affair with Natalie, the robbery accusation from Philippe Perrier, and the angry confrontation with Mike outside the club a few days earlier. Julian listened in silence, his eyes widening. He told Lionel that this sounded like an incredibly dangerous situation, pointing out that the Perrier family was extremely powerful and that making enemies of people like that could end very badly. But Lionel, seeing how worried Julian was getting, quickly tried to downplay the situation. He patted Julian on the shoulder and told him not to worry. He said that his phone call with Mike just now had actually gone really well. He claimed that he and Mike had talked things through and that Mike had realized Lionel was telling the truth about the robbery. Lionel said that everything was back to normal, that the misunderstanding had been cleared up, and that Mike had actually just called to invite him out for a quick drink to put the whole drama behind them. Julian felt a bit relieved, but he still had a lingering bad feeling about the whole thing. Just then, Lionel's phone buzzed in his hand with a text message. At the same time, the headlights of a car swept across the living room window, indicating that someone had just pulled up outside the apartment building. Lionel stood up, grabbed his jacket from the back of the couch, and slipped it on. He looked at Julian and told him that his ride was here. He said he would be back in just a few hours and told Julian to have a good night. Then, Lionel opened the front door, stepped out into the cool mountain air, and walked down the stairs. That was the last time Julian, or anyone else in Lionel's family, would ever see him alive. By the evening of May 1st, 2012, 2 full days had passed since Lionel walked out the door, and Julian was in a state of absolute panic. Lionel had not come home that Sunday night, which was unusual, but Julian had initially tried to convince himself that Lionel had just stayed over at a friend's place or had gone to an after-hours party. But as Monday turned into Tuesday and Lionel's phone continued to go straight to voicemail, his anxiety reached a breaking point. Lionel was a highly responsible guy when it came to his family. He lived with his mother and always let her know if he was going to be late or if he was staying somewhere else. He would never simply disappear for 48 hours without a single text or call to let them know he was safe. Julian called Lionel's friends, but none of them had seen him. Finally, Julian called the manager of the nightclub where Lionel worked his regular shifts. The manager told Julian that Lionel had uncharacteristically failed to show up for his scheduled work, and he had not called in sick either. This was the final straw. Julian knew that Lionel was a big, tough guy who could easily handle himself in a physical fight, but he also knew about the wealthy and powerful enemies Lionel had recently made. Deep down, Julian felt a sickening certainty that something terrible had happened to his uncle. He walked out of his apartment, drove straight to the Chambéry police station, and reported Lionel Vines as a missing person. The next day, May 2nd, Captain Florent Mazeron of the Chambéry Police Department officially took over the investigation into Lionel's disappearance. Mazeron was an experienced investigator and he knew Chambéry inside and out. Like many people in the town, Mazeron actually knew who Lionel was. He had seen him working at the clubs and knew him to be a steady, reliable figure in the community. Mazeron immediately recognized that this was not a simple case of an adult deciding to run away or take a sudden vacation. People like Lionel did not just vanish into thin air, leaving their worried mothers and families behind without their phone, their car, or their money. Mazeron spoke at length with Julian, who was visibly shaking as he recounted the events of the past few days. Julian told the detective about the robbery accusation, the affair with Natalie, and the fact that Lionel had left the apartment on Sunday night to go meet up with Mike Booth. Julian also mentioned that when Lionel walked out the door, he saw the headlights of a car pulling up outside, and he believed that Mike was the one driving that car. Mazeron realized that Mike Booth was the absolute key to finding out what had happened to Lionel. He was the last person known to have spoken to him, the last person Lionel went to meet, and he had a clear connection to a wealthy, angry husband who believed Lionel had ruined his marriage and stolen his money. Mazeron immediately sent officers to bring Mike Booth in for questioning. By the afternoon of May 2nd, Mike Booth was sitting in an interrogation room at the Chambéry police station. Captain Mazeron walked into the room carrying a thin folder and sat down across from Mike. Mike looked relatively calm, though he had an air of nervous curiosity about him, as if he was trying to figure out exactly how much the police knew. Mazeron started by asking Mike about his relationship with Lionel. Mike admitted that they were close friends and went out drinking often. Mazeron then transitioned to the robbery at Philippe Perrier's house. Mike did not deny his involvement in that situation. He explained that Philippe was his very good friend and neighbor, and that when Philippe's house was burglarized, Philippe had been devastated. Mike admitted that he had confronted Lionel about the break-in because Philippe had found out about Lionel's affair with his wife, Natalie. Mike said he had simply acted as a mediator, trying to get to the bottom of the situation for his friend. He claimed that when he confronted Lionel outside the club, Lionel had passionately denied having anything to do with the robbery. Mike told Mazeron that he had believed Lionel, had passed that message along to Philippe, and as far as he was concerned, the entire matter was settled. He painted a picture of himself as a helpful friend who had successfully diffused a highly volatile situation. Mazeron listened patiently, but he was watching Mike's body language very closely. He then asked Mike the critical question, "Where were you on the night of Sunday, April 29th, the night Lionel disappeared?" Instantly, Mike's calm demeanor vanished. His eyes darted away from Mazeron and he began to fidget in his chair, shifting his weight and looking down at his hands on the table. He cleared his throat and told Mazeron that he had been home all night. He claimed that he had stayed in with his girlfriend, watching television and relaxing. He did admit that he had called Lionel earlier that evening to see if he wanted to get a drink, but he claimed that Lionel had declined, and so they had never actually met up. Mike insisted that he had not seen Lionel at all that night. Mazeron let out a slow breath. He knew that Julian had sworn he saw a car pull up outside the apartment just as Lionel left, and Julian was convinced it was Mike's car. But of course, Julian could have been mistaken in the dark. Mazarin needed proof. He looked at Mike and asked for his girlfriend's name and phone number so that he could call her and verify the alibi. Mike hesitated for a second, a flicker of panic crossing his face, but he knew he could not refuse without looking incredibly guilty. He wrote down her contact information and handed it over. Mazarin got up, walked out of the room, and closed the door behind him. Standing in the hallway, Mazarin dialed the number Mike had given him. When Mike's girlfriend answered, Mazarin identified himself as a police detective and explained that he was conducting a routine inquiry. He asked her if she could walk him through what she and Mike had done on the evening of Sunday, April 29th. The girlfriend sounded confused and a bit nervous. She told Mazarin that she had been home alone all night. She said she had watched a movie by herself, and then she had gone to sleep around midnight. When Mazarin asked if Mike had been with her, she explicitly stated that Mike had not been home at all that evening. In fact, she said that when she fell asleep, Mike was still out, and she had no idea what time he had finally come home, or if he had come home at all that night. Mazarin thanked her and hung up the phone. He now had definitive proof that Mike Booth was lying to the police about his whereabouts on the night his best friend vanished. This immediately made Mike the primary suspect in what was quickly looking like a homicide investigation. But Mazarin knew he needed to look at the bigger picture. If Mike was lying to cover his tracks, who else was he protecting? Mazarin decided it was time to pay a visit to the wealthy winery owner who had started this entire chain of events. Later that evening, on May 2nd, Captain Mazarin drove out of the city center and into a quiet, exclusive residential neighborhood on the outskirts of Chambéry. This was where the wealthy elite lived, far away from the noise of the nightlife. He pulled his car up to a massive, beautifully landscaped estate and parked in the grand driveway. This was the home of Philippe Perrier. Mazarin walked up to the heavy wooden front door and rang the bell. After a few moments, the door was opened by Philippe himself. Philippe was a well-dressed, distinguished-looking man, but he looked tired and surprised to see a police officer on his doorstep. He immediately asked Mazarin if he was there to give him an update on the investigation into the robbery of his home. Mazarin gave a vague answer, saying he was there to follow up on a few details and asked if he could come inside to talk. Philippe hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes scanning Mazarin's face, but then he stepped aside and gestured for the detective to enter. Mazarin was led into a sprawling, luxurious living room filled with expensive art and high-end furniture. Once they were both seated, Mazarin asked Philippe to walk him through the details of the robbery. Philippe explained that his wife, Natalie, had come home one afternoon and discovered that one of the ground floor windows had been smashed. When they checked the house, they realized that their heavy safe in the basement had been broken into and a very large amount of cash was missing. Mazarin asked Philippe if he had any suspicions about who could have done it. Philippe did not hesitate. He looked directly at Mazarin and said that he believed a local bouncer named Lionel Vines was the burglar. He openly admitted that he had discovered Lionel was having an affair with his wife, Natalie, and that Natalie herself had suggested Lionel was the one who broke in. Mazarin was stunned by how calm and matter-of-fact Philippe was being about his wife's infidelity. Most husbands would be furious, but Philippe spoke with a cold, detached precision. Mazarin knew that this affair gave Philippe an incredibly powerful motive to want Lionel dead. If Philippe had discovered the affair, he might have decided to take matters into his own hands. Mazarin decided to push a bit further. He asked Philippe if he owned any firearms. Philippe nodded and said that he did, explaining that he was an avid hunter and target shooter. Mazarin asked if he could see the weapons, and Philippe agreed, leading the detective down a set of stairs into a large, cold basement. In the corner of the basement stood a large, heavy gun safe, surrounded by several plastic rifle cases. Mazarin walked over and began examining the cases. When he opened one of them, which was designed to hold 2 high-powered hunting rifles, he noticed that it was completely empty. Mazarin looked at Philippe and asked where the 2 weapons were. Philippe looked back at him calmly and said that those 2 guns had also been stolen during the robbery. Mazarin stared at the empty gun case, his mind racing. Philippe had a massive motive to harm Lionel, a basement full of weapons, and now he was claiming 2 of his guns had gone missing during a robbery. It was highly possible that Philippe had used those weapons to confront Lionel and then claimed they were stolen to cover his tracks. But Mazarin found it hard to believe that a man as wealthy as Philippe Perrier would risk his freedom to commit a brutal murder. And if he had, why would he be so cooperative with the police? He had admitted to the affair, showed his gun safe, and pointed out the missing weapons. It did not seem like the behavior of a guilty man. Mazarin realized that until they found Lionel or some physical evidence of a crime, he could not arrest Philippe or Mike. He had to find out what happened. There were simply too many unanswered questions at this point, and without a body or a confession, his hands were tied. The next morning, May 3rd, Mazerin was back in his office, staring at his notes, when there was a soft knock on his door. He looked up to see a woman standing there. She was pale, her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and she seemed to be trembling. She introduced herself as Natalie Perrier. Mazerin had contacted her earlier, asking her to come in for an interview, but he was shocked by the state she was in. As she walked into the room, she stumbled slightly, and Mazerin had to help her to a chair. She apologized profusely, explaining that she was on heavy prescription medication to help her deal with her anxiety, and that the entire situation had completely shattered her nerves. Once she had calmed down slightly, Mazerin began asking her about her relationship with Lionel. Natalie wept as she admitted to the affair. She said she had met Lionel at a club and that they had hooked up a few times, but she insisted that it was a huge mistake that she deeply regretted. She said she had confessed the affair to her husband, Philippe, because she could not live with the guilt anymore. When Mazerin asked her about the robbery, Natalie said that during their brief time together, Lionel had complained to her about having massive debts from playing high-stakes poker. She said that because of his financial desperation, she had immediately assumed he was the one who broke into her home and stole their cash. Mazerin asked Natalie where she and her husband had been on the night of Sunday, April 29th. Natalie wiped her eyes and said that they had been home together all night. She claimed they had dinner, watched television, and went to bed early. She swore that Philippe had never left the house that night and that if he had gone to confront Lionel, she would have known about it. Mazerin watched her closely. Natalie seemed genuinely devastated, but he could not help but wonder if her tears were caused by guilt rather than grief. Was she crying because she was worried about Lionel, or was she crying because she knew her husband had killed him? Or perhaps she was hiding something even darker, but without any hard evidence. Mazerin had to let her go. He felt like he was spinning his wheels, caught in a classic love triangle where everyone had a motive to lie, but no one was giving up the truth. That was until his phone rang a few hours later and the entire investigation took a sudden, dramatic turn. The call was from a detective with the police department in Marseille, a major port city on the southern coast of France, more than 200 miles away from Chambéry. The detective told Mazerin that they had just run the fingerprints of an unidentified body through their national database, and they had gotten a match. The body belonged to Lionel Vines. Mazerin was completely stunned. He asked the Marseille detective for details, and the detective explained that the body had been found early on the morning of April 30th by a local resident walking in a wooded area near the coast. The body had been placed in the middle of a large bonfire and set alight. The fire had badly charred the remains, but the medical examiner had been able to recover enough skin on the fingertips to get a positive identification. The detective also added a crucial piece of information. The medical examiner had found a single bullet wound in the back of Lionel's head. He had been shot at point-blank range before his body was placed on the fire. Mazerin hung up the phone, his mind reeling. Marseille was a 4-hour drive from Chambéry. Lionel had no known connections to the city, no family there, and no reason to go there. If he had left Chambéry on Sunday night and his body was found burning in Marseille on Monday morning, it meant his killers had driven him all that way, or had killed him and transported his body. Mazerin immediately packed his bags and drove down to Marseille to inspect the crime scene himself. He met with the local detectives, who led him into the quiet coastal woods where the body had been found. As Mazerin stood in the small clearing, looking at the blackened earth and the scattered pieces of charred wood, the local officers explained their theory. They told Mazerin that this was a classic gangland execution commonly referred to in the French criminal underworld as a barbecue. Drug trafficking gangs in Marseille were notorious for using this exact method to dispose of their enemies. They would shoot the victim in the head, drive them to a secluded wooded area, pile wood on top of them, and set them on fire. It was designed to destroy physical evidence, make identification as difficult as possible, and send a terrifying message to anyone else who crossed the gang. Mazerin listened, feeling a sudden chill. Could he have been completely wrong about this case from the very beginning? Lionel was a bouncer who worked in clubs where drug dealers and gang members surely operated. He had a history of getting into fights, and Natalie had mentioned that he had massive gambling debts. It was highly possible that Lionel had gotten deep into debt with some very dangerous people in the criminal underworld, and they had decided to execute him. If that was the case, then Mike, Philippe, and Natalie might actually have had nothing to do with his death. But Mazerin remained highly skeptical of the gang theory. The timing was too coincidental. He believed the killers had staged the scene to look like a gangland execution to mislead the police. Since Marseille was a 4-hour drive from Chambéry, the killers had to travel along the main highways on the night of April 29th. Mazerin began a painstaking search of security cameras. On the evening of May 5th, at a gas station 100 miles from the crime scene, he hit the jackpot. Footage from 5:43 a.m. on April 30th showed a black Volkswagen with a Chambéry license plate pulling up to the pumps. Although the driver was blurry, the rising sun illuminated the passenger seat. Sitting there was Philippe Perrier. Mazeron knew the car belonged to Mike Booth. This was the definitive proof he needed. The gangland theory was dead. With this evidence, Mazeron arrested Philippe, Natalie, and Mike. Under intense questioning, Mike broke down and confessed everything. On the night of April 29th, Mike and Natalie had picked up Lionel, pretending they wanted to clear up the robbery accusation. Lionel got into the front seat, unaware that Natalie was hiding in the back with a gun she had taken from Philippe's safe. As Mike drove, Natalie began screaming at Lionel about her obsession and his rejection. The argument escalated quickly and Natalie shot Lionel in the back of the head. Panicked, Mike drove to the Perrier estate. Philippe, desperate to protect his family name from a ruinous scandal, decided to cover up the crime. He and Mike drove Lionel's body to Marseille, built a bonfire to stage a gangland execution, and threw the murder weapon into a river. The subsequent trial shocked Chambéry. In 2014, Natalie Perrier was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Mike Booth was sentenced to 6 years for kidnapping and destroying evidence. Philippe Perrier received 3 years for his role in disposing of the body. He and Natalie divorced shortly after. The robbery that sparked the entire tragedy was later suspected to be a complete fabrication by Natalie, staged to force her husband and Mike to help her confront Lionel. For Lionel's family, especially his nephew Julian, the pain was permanent. Lionel had spent his life protecting others, only to be lured into a trap by those he trusted. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments, and remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya!